Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovetter, and I have a cough, and I cannot promise that I will get through this episode, which is episode 27, Intimacy in Prayer. I cannot promise that I can get through said episode without coughing at some point, although I will try, and I will at least back away from the microphone and cough way over here if I have to. So, that being said, let's get to it. This episode, Intimacy in Prayer. What I want to talk about is what it means to have a prayer life in which we experience closeness with God. And I don't know, maybe this isn't as much of a how-to sort of episode, but it's something that I just want to put out in the open because it's true about my spiritual life. I bet it's true about yours too, that I go through times where I feel the closeness with God, the intimacy of God with God in my prayer life. And then there are times when I definitely do not. In fact, I perceive God's distance. I feel like God is absent. And this experience of the drawing near and the coming, the distance, it feels like, the perceived presence, perceived absence, that experience is a real obstacle of prayer, because our ideal is certainly that we would always experience prayer as a moment of being close to God. And we have moments like that, and we want all of our prayer life to be like that, but it just isn't so. And for me personally, I find that to be a real obstacle because it's really easy to become discouraged in prayer when we don't have the sort of feeling that comes with it that we kind of expect, or that really represents something very good and golden and pure. And I just want us to have a conversation today in this episode about that, because one of the greatest obstacles of prayer, well, one is that we just don't structure our lives to make time for it, okay? But right in there, maybe number 2 on the obstacle list, I think, for me, is discouragement and disillusionment in our lives of prayer. It's just true. We get into these moments where we don't get out of it what we think we should, and it becomes easy to kind of back away from it, skip a few times, whatever, move further, make further and further away from a life of prayer. And I want to just counter that a little bit here. I think we've said before in other episodes that, it's not always about the way we feel. It's not always about our experience within prayer. Okay, episode 11, it's called More Than a Feeling. We kind of pushed against that a little bit there. You might want to check that episode out. But I do want to talk about the experience of closeness as something that we are, working towards, and we do hope that we have greater and greater intimacy with God. But we need to understand that that's not just a smooth, from the bottom left hand to the top right hand kind of graph. We're not going to move from distance to closeness in anything like a linear fashion. In fact, we're going to have lots of fits and starts. We're going to have some times where And I think in a good way, our perceptiveness of spirituality, of the perceptiveness of the Holy Spirit, leaves us to recognize that something of what we hold as an illusion of, or what we hold as a experience of the closeness of God, sometimes that's an illusion, and when it's pulled away from us, we don't really know what to do. Over the last year, I've been reading through John of the Cross. He's a Spanish mystic. He's kind of the founder of the Carmelite order of monks and friars spirituality, or that order of spirituality, and within the Catholic tradition. And John's, one of John's things that he's really famous for is this idea of the dark night of the soul, which is this experience of what seems like the absence of God, or what seems like, I guess, a fruitlessness in our lives of prayer, in our spirituality. And John writes about that as such a powerful experience that, and just that it's painful. It's like searing, to your soul. And at the same time, it's not something that's bad. It's something that's good, because maybe the surface levels of our spirituality are kind of being pulled away from us, and we're really learning to sense and perceive God. Even in God's absence, even in the darkness, we're perceiving something that's different and maybe even truer to form than what we're kind of constructing in our own minds. Okay, at the same time, I read things like what John has to say about intimacy with God, And John, like the other Spanish mystics, or not just Spanish mystics, the other mystics in the spiritual life, speak about God as something that's so near and close and like burning like fire, within you. And, that's just not my normal experience of prayer. And I know it's not yours either. And you don't have to hide behind that. Sometimes what I feel and I experience in prayer doesn't match up with what I expect and what I would hope would happen. Okay? I think it's true for all of us, and we have to guard against the disillusionment that could be a part of that. At the same time, though, when they talk about that experience of God, the closeness of God, and like John writes about it, and he's not the only, writers of the spiritual life to do this. He writes about like intimacy with God in the life of prayer, almost like he writes about it in like straight up sexual terms, okay? Like this kind of language of intimacy that he's drawing, like a lot of times he's drawing like straight out of Song of Solomon. I'm reading this stuff and I'm just like, what in the world? I mean, some of that language, honestly, I'm not even sure if I'm like comfortable with it. I'm just reading it and I'm thinking, not only is this like weird, because I guess our sexual culture or whatnot, but like it just, I don't perceive of my prayers typically of having that sort of intimacy. And then, amazingly, there are times that I feel like the veil kind of comes away, and I do perceive the closeness with God. But those are, honestly for me, those are exceptional times. Most of my prayer life is about simply being still and listening and drawing as near as I can to God, but also recognizing that distance. And sometimes that distance itself is actually good for me. Maybe painful, maybe not be what I want, but sometimes it just calls me to realize that, I'm still in a journey. I'm still on this road to intimacy with God, but I'm not all the way there. Not just John of the cross, but another great example of intimacy is, of course, the prayer life of Jesus. And Jesus, well known for his life of prayer, very well attested in the Gospels about how he would go off and spend long nights or even long periods of time, in solitary prayer with God. One of the striking features of his prayer life is his reference to God as Abba, the Father, and this kind of familiar sort of term. I don't know how much to make of that, kind of read a little bit different. Some people like make a lot of it, like this is like a real innovative thing that Jesus is doing. Maybe others maybe push against that, I'll lean against a little bit. But I do think, however we might make of that term, I do think God, the life of spirituality that Jesus exemplifies, demonstrates a great intimacy and closeness with God. Jesus seems to have perceived God's nearness in his spirituality. And also, on the cross, there seems to be this moment where Jesus feels forsaken by God too. And yet, you kind of go back and forth on this on it. It's just striking that Jesus' experience of God is this nearness, mostly. But that's even with Jesus, that's not universal. I don't really know what to make of that, except for, I think, to say that it is what we're pushing towards, what we're leaning into, and yet maybe we don't need to beat ourselves up too much when we feel like we're not as close, not as intimate with God in that moment as we should be. We don't have to demand of ourselves an absolute intimacy with God. And yet, we can be leaning towards, pushing towards, walking towards an increasingly intimate experience of God and God's Spirit. I want to just offer a couple of things about this. Like I said, this isn't like really a how-to episode. It's just something I want to kind of open up. I'm sure many of you have kind of experienced this back and forth, in a life of prayer. Sometimes it feels really hollow, and sometimes it feels like really full and deep. And so I just wanted to kind of open that up in this episode, but I do want to offer a couple of pointers towards this. The first one is just kind of what we've been talking about, and that is just don't sweat it. You can't make it happen. Even John of the Cross writes about it, like you can't manipulate God into revealing, the divine presence in this intimate way all the time. And instead of that, you just got to have some peace about where you are in your life with God. You may be leaning more into a direction and seeking to draw nearer and nearer. Okay, but you don't need to punish yourself when you're not in that place. Okay. And the second thing I'd say is just remember that you're taking a long road here. There's no shortcuts to intimacy, not with humans and not with God. So remember that it's not about whether you feel intimate with God in this moment, but keep walking, keep putting one step in front of the other, and keep putting in the time, okay? And let yourself be still. Think about the people that you know best, that you have the most intimate relationships with in life. Those things didn't just happen. They came probably through not just minutes, but hours of time over, maybe strung together over years. And, seek that sort of relationship with God that looks not just for something that's right now just immediate, but something that you're building, you're developing this relationship, on into the future. So, don't sweat it, take the long road. But then the third thing is be willing to be quiet. Don't be afraid of silence. Intimacy, I think, develops the best. Intimacy with God develops the best when we become willing over time to not fear the silence, but to allow it to wash over us and soak into it and just kind of sit there and continue 100, 1,000,000, a billion times to call our attention back to the reality of God's presence, whether we feel it or not. And as we do that, we begin to cultivate and not to provoke, not to demand, but we cultivate over years an intimacy of prayer. And that's what we're working towards. Hey, look, not every moment of prayer that you're going to have is going to be marked by an emotional intensity. It's not going to be marked by the direct experience of intimacy with God. But over the long road, step by step, you're going to be drawing nearer to God. Okay? Let that work. Let time have its say. Let it do its work. And just in the meantime, just trust that God's reality doesn't depend on your emotional experience of it. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and love for you to chime in. You can holler at me on Facebook or on Twitter. If you want to extend that conversation, just please do. And if this sort of thing is useful to you, then subscribe via Facebook, or not just via Facebook, but via whatever podcasting app you choose. And we'll be back soon with a new episode. Thanks again for listening. And keep taking the next step that you see in front of you, each step on that long, long journey. And may God be with you on every step. All right. Peace.